A few days before the school year ended, about a month ago, the middle school students, all 257 of them, visited our World War II display. And when Jeff Birchfield, the principal at the school, was arranging the schedule with Selena Anderson, the curator of the Sue Crotty Museum, he mentioned to Celine that a couple of the middle school classes in their unit on World War II had discussed the Holocaust, and he wondered if we had anybody who could talk about it. Well, since I'm the only Jewish guy in town, at least that I know of right now, and since I'm also president of the Historical Society, all the heads looked at me, all the eyes turned towards me. So after mulling it over a little bit, I thought, okay, I can do this. I've always been fascinated with the period in history from the end of World War I to the end of World War II, and I've probably read upwards of 100 books on it. So I thought, okay, I can give the talk. About that same time, one evening I was looking for some information around the house on my late wife Sue's family, and I ran across this notebook. And this is Sue's family tree on her mother's side. It was compiled about 40 years ago by a cousin of hers, Leo Honig, and as I browsed through it, I realized that it would be the centerpiece of my talk to the kids. Henry Bender, born October 11th, 1866, Munster, Germany, died Holocaust. Emma Hertz Bender, born Polch, died Holocaust. Adolf Bender, born February 2nd, 1889, Munster, and his wife Lottie and their daughter Edith, died Holocaust. Donald Bender, born December 5th, 1889, Munster, died Holocaust. Alice Bender, and her birth date's not given, died Holocaust. Irene Bender, born January 12th, and her husband, his name's not listed, and they had 2 sons, and their names aren't listed, all from Munster, all died Holocaust. Joseph Forst, born August 1st, 1896, and his wife Betty Bender Forst, and their daughter Wilma, born 1932, died Holocaust. Carl Bender, born July 16th, 1901, Munster, and his wife Alice Egner Bender, and their daughter Wilma, died Holocaust. I read 17 names out of here, and you probably noticed that they all had the name Bender. Carol Bender, that was her maiden name, was Sue's maternal grandmother. So these relatives were all Sue's grandmother and subsequently Sue's aunts, uncles, and cousins. And in Sue's case, they were her great aunts and uncles. You also probably noticed that in most cases I read when and where they were born. But then something went missing because I didn't read when and where they died because it's not there. It just says Holocaust. And what probably happened is they ended up in a concentration camp like Auschwitz, Mauthausen, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Belzec, Theresienstadt, Sobibor, or some of the other almost 1,000 camps that Nazi Germany had during World War II. And what specifically happened, how they got to these places, one of these camps, probably went something like this. And by the way, when I told this next little story to the kids, they got deathly quiet and their eyes just got riveted. I'd never experienced anything like this. Actually, it was a little unnerving. So imagine this. You and your family are at home asleep at night. It's the middle of the night, and you hear a knock, a pounding at the door. So you go down to the door and you open it, and you're confronted with a cadre of Nazi SS, Waffen-SS soldiers. Now, the Waffen-SS was a highly, intensely trained units of the Nazi military that were responsible for most of the horrible atrocities that you've heard about in World War II. A lot of them were brought up through the Hitler Youth Organization, and they were brainwashed from the time they were 12 or 14, 16 years old. Others were actual felons who were let out of the prisons when Hitler opened the prisons after he came to power in 1933. And these people were recruited and then trained in the most horrible, brutal type of racism you can possibly imagine. So you're confronted with these officers at your door, and one of them tells you that you and your family have 15 or 20 minutes to gather up with what you can and be outside front of your house and go down to an assembly area in town where they tell you to go. So you run around the house, you grab some clothes, maybe a toothbrush, a photo album, and you and your family go out there, and you're confronted with hundreds, maybe thousands of other people coming down the street who have been given the same orders. So you go down to the assembly area, and you're surrounded by the SS, and you might be standing around or waiting there for 2 or 3 days, or maybe just a few minutes. But eventually, you are taken down to a train station or a railroad siding, and there's a train there. But it's not a passenger train, it's a freight train with cattle cars. And you're all pushed into those cattle cars so tightly that you can't move. You can only stand like this. And there's no food, there's no water, there's no toilet. The only toilet might be a bucket in a corner of the car, but there's so many people in there you couldn't get to it anyway. So the train lurches off, and you might be on that train for 2, 3, 4, 5 days. People are defecating and urinating on each other, and the only light coming in is through the slats in the side of the car. And when you get to your destination and they open the doors, you're confronted by SS with rifles, machine guns, whips, and attack dogs. And they tell you to move quickly out of that car, and if you don't move quickly enough, you're whipped or you might be shot on the spot. At that point, the men are separated from the women and children, and you're put into a line. And when you get to the front of the line, there's an SS soldier there who might ask you, what skills do you have? Are you a carpenter, a bricklayer, a painter? What can you do, a seamstress? And depending on how you answer that question, you're told to go left or right. So you're in another line, and you're all herded down into another building, into a big room. The doors are shut, and there are shower faucets on the ceiling. And you're all given an ice-cold shower for about 2 minutes, and then you're doused with a disinfectant, which was oftentimes lye. It burns the skin. And the reason behind that is to control lice. The Nazis, the SS, they were desperately afraid of lice. After that, you're given a thin pair of striped pajama-type clothing. You've seen the pictures. No underwear. And then you're herded down to a barracks, and you're either assigned a bunk or you choose a bunk that's probably occupied by 6, 8, or 10 people. And the only mattress on the bunk is a thin layer of straw, probably less than 1/2 inch. If you're in the other line, you're told to strip naked, even in the dead of winter, and you're taken down to a building and you're put into a big room, and the door is sealed, and there's shower faucets on the scene, but it's not a shower, it's a gas chamber. And there are soldiers up on the roof of that building with canisters of Cyclone B. Now, Cyclone B was originally designed as an insecticide, a fumigant, but it has a little bit of cyanide in it, And the SS, the Nazis, discovered that if a lot of people were in a confined room and they breathed that in, it would kill them all in about 15 or 20 minutes. And it was a lot more efficient, which is a bad word to use, but it was a lot more efficient than mowing them down with machine guns or trying to kill mass murder using carbon monoxide out of a vehicle. So all these people are in the room and the soldiers are up on the roof, and they take these canisters, and there's little receptacles all along the roof, and they go along the roof and they drop these canisters into the receptacles, and they shut the lid, which pierces the can, which activates the pellets and releases the gas, and it comes down through the shower heads, and everybody's dead in about 15 or 20 minutes. Then SS, they evacuate the gas from the room, they open the doors, and then they force other prisoners in the camp, mostly Jews, to go in there and pull out all those bodies. And it's just a tangle of torsos and arms and legs. And those other prisoners go in there and pull out those bodies, and with wagons or wheelbarrows or whatever they have, they take them to a crematorium where they're going to be burned. But the problem is they can't burn them fast enough. So there's bodies piled up all over the camp like little piles of brush or piles of grain. That's what the Holocaust is all about. If you look up the Holocaust online, like in Wikipedia or Encyclopedia Britannica, this is what it says. The systematic, state-sponsored killing of 6 million Jewish men, women, and children, and millions of others by Nazi Germany and its collaborators. The Jews weren't the only ones singled out, there were others. And the Gypsies were the other main ones. But as the war went on, the Nazis became obsessed with the Jews, killing the Jews, to the point that as the war was winding down and defeat was imminent for Hitler, the Nazis, the SS, continued to use up what limited resources Germany had left, transporting Jews from camp to camp to try to keep away from the Allies so they could kill more of them. This diabolical plan was all worked up and planned at the Wannsee Conference on January 20th of 1942. And this was a meeting of high-ranking SS officers. And they called it the Wannsee Conference because it took place in Wannsee, Germany. It's a suburb of Berlin. And at that meeting, an SS lieutenant colonel by the name of Adolf Eichmann coined the phrase, the final solution. And what he meant by that was the final solution to the Jewish problem. And the final solution was the total annihilation of the Jews from the face of the earth. So how did this happen? Why didn't anybody do anything to try to stop it? And the answer is really complicated, but there are a few main points. And the first one is nobody knew. The Nazis did this in secrecy, and they were able to cover it up until almost the end of the war. And the next point is disbelief. Nobody believed it. The United States and Canada and Great Britain and the other allies just couldn't conceive that a 20th century industrialized country like Germany would do something like this. And an example of this is on April 12, 1945, General Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces, rode into the Buchenwald concentration camp. And actually where they were is they went into a place called Ohrdruf, which was a sub-camp of Buchenwald. Buchenwald was huge. It was the first camp that Eisenhower and his aides had been in. So he's in this camp for the first time, and he's looking around, and he is appalled at what he sees. He sees bodies piled up like brush, like I talked about. He sees shallow ditches with mutilated corpses. And he sees the remaining prisoners that are left in the camp in their pajama-type clothes, malnourished, sickly, half dead. Eisenhower was so taken aback at what he saw that a few days later he sent a telegram, a cable, to his superior, General George Marshall, Chief of Staff, who later became Secretary of State under President Truman and was the father of the Marshall Plan for the rebuilding of Western Europe. And I'm just going to read you what Eisenhower's telegram said. I have visited one of these, he's talking about the camps, myself, and assure you that whatever has been printed on them to date has been an understatement. If you would see any advantage in asking about a dozen leaders of Congress and a dozen prominent editors to make a short visit, I will arrange to have them conducted to one of these places where the evidence of bestiality and cruelty is so overpowering as to leave no doubt in their minds about the normal practices of the Germans in these camps. So you can see that Ike realized the world didn't know what was going on, and in fact, he didn't even realize the extent of it. The next point is limited resources. The Allies were fighting a war on two fronts, Germany and Japan, and the military just didn't feel that they could divert resources, munitions, and what was needed to do anything about these camps, to take them out, when they really didn't know what was going on in them. Example of that is in early 1945, the British made a night bombing raid and hit their target 2 miles from Auschwitz, but they never bombed the camp. The last point I want to talk about is isolationism. And this is pretty specific just to the United States, not to the other allies. But there were people high up in our government and very influential people outside of our government who felt that we shouldn't be involved in the war in the first place. They argued that this was a European war and this was none of our business. And one of the most prominent outspoken people outside of the government was Charles Lindbergh, the famous pilot who made the first transatlantic flight from New York to Paris in 1927, the Spirit of St. Louis. He had been going around the country making speeches about how we shouldn't be involved in this war, and at the same time making derogatory comments about the Jews. And on September 11th of 1941, less than 3 months before Pearl Harbor, he made a famous speech in Des Moines where he said this: "The three most important groups who have been pressing this country towards war are the British, the Jewish, and the Roosevelt administration."
In selecting these three groups as the major agitators for war, I have included only those whose support is essential to the war party. If any of these groups, the British, the Jewish, or the administration, stops agitating for war, I believe there will be little danger of our involvement. We cannot allow the natural passions and prejudices of other peoples to lead our country to destruction. The Roosevelt administration is the third powerful group which has been carrying this country toward war. The danger of the Roosevelt administration lies in its subterfuge. While its members have promised us peace, they have led us to war, heedless of the platform upon which they were elected.
And another one was Henry Ford, the head of Ford Motor Company at the time. He had been sending articles and essays and editorials to newspapers and magazines all over the country, promoting isolationist views and also making derogatory comments about the Jews. And at one point he owned the Dearborn Independent newspaper in Dearborn, Michigan, where Ford's headquarters is. And every week, he wrote a front page editorial under this title, under this headline: "The International Jew, the World's Problem." My dad disliked Henry Ford so much that he would never buy a Ford. When we were growing up, we never had a Ford. It was Chrysler's. And then, all of a sudden, about the year 2000, a few years before Dad passed away, he goes and he buys a Ford Taurus. And us kids, we razzed him about this. And then he got the car, and all he did was complain about it, and he kept calling it a Tin Lizzie. So isolationism has not gone away. It's back with us a little bit with the Ukraine and so forth. But there's something that's kind of a spin-off of isolationism that's really much more insidious and much more dangerous, and that's called Holocaust denial. Mm-hmm. There are groups like the Patriot Front and the Institute for Historical Review. These are kind of innocuous names. And the National Alliance, who are trying to convince the public that the Holocaust never even happened, and if it did happen, it wasn't nearly as bad as we've been led to believe. In fact, there's actually been a court case about this in the year 2000. David Irving versus Deborah Lipstadt. Now, Deborah Lipstadt is one of the foremost authorities on the Holocaust in the United States. She's a professor of history at Emory University in Atlanta. And she's written numerous books about the Holocaust, and several of them about the danger of Holocaust denial. And she's taken to task some of the people who've been promoting these theories. And one of those was David Irving. He's a historian in London. And he sued Deborah Lipstadt for defamation because he claimed that when she criticized him in one of her books, the sales of his books tailed off, and so he sued her for damages. And she hired a London law firm and had to go over there to defend herself. And she won the case. David Irving didn't get one penny. And when the judge handed down the decision, the judge admonished David Irving for outright lying in his books and for twisting and distorting the facts. In the simplest terms, the Holocaust was a sadistic, systematic plan of mass murder. The evidence is overwhelming and it's everywhere. It's in documents, a lot of them confiscated from the Germans at the end of the war, some of them even showing schematic drawings and blueprints of these camps and showing where the gas chambers and the crematoriums were. Others in photos, also some captured from the Nazis, and others from our own military, like the pictures of Eisenhower at Buchenwald. And you're going to see a couple of examples of these photographs with a local connection in our museum. Then there's memoirs, first-person memoirs like the Diary of Anne Frank, Corrie ten Boom's The Hiding Place, Elie Wiesel's Night. And then there's the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of accounts from other eyewitnesses over the years, survivors, many of which who testified at the Nuremberg war trials, the trial of Adolf Eichmann, and the trials of other Nazi war criminals. In 3 years, it'll be 80 years since the end of World War II. And one of the great rallying cries heard around the world when the war was over was the phrase, "never again." And for the victims of the Holocaust, that phrase means a lot more than just the end of the war. And now there are those who wanted to erase history and forget about the millions of people who were slaughtered including the 17 members of Sue's family. And if that's where we're headed, what does never again really mean for all of us? Thank you.